Welcome to 23 Degrees Sideways. We're going to talk a little bit more about Pete Buttigieg and the Transportation Secretary of the United States. I don't know how he got there. How did he get there? No background, no information, no real, where did he come from to get this job? And the answers aren't very good. He's part of a political. The only proof that I have that works for me, that as I record this at the very end of March in 2021, that Joe Biden is not being run entirely by the intelligence services, that the secret powers, the government behind the government, because Joe Biden's not it. He's not capable. The only proof I have that it's not a cabal of the intelligence services is that things like Pete Buttigieg happen. That leads me to believe that there is actually a dominant elite in the Democratic Party itself that is involved in choosing and running the United States, choosing the government and running the United States, and it's not completely internal to the intelligence establishment state. And if you think that's really weird, we could get in, to ask me, tell me. I'll do some videos on what's happened over the past decade to lead me to believe that we have a problem with a shadow government. Okay, I think it kind of is heartening to me that we do have obvious things like Pete Buttigieg that indicate that it is political machine, not just a shadow government, because that means we're not completely gone yet. Political machines, power brokering, all of that, we can work with that. We can fight it, we can tune it, we can mess with it. Once the intelligence agencies just basically take over everything and do and tell politicians what they're allowed to do, which was the whole problem with the Trump era. They wanted to do that, and he wasn't listening. He wasn't very amenable to that. Anyway, transportation. So, in a previous video, I talked about fundamental human right, travel as a fundamental human right. We're going to rehash some ground, because I've done videos on this before. I usually do it in the context of bigger, better, faster, more. Okay, that's how you make ecological, green, environmentalist solutions work, is you make them bigger, better, faster, more. The program of, you must reduce your life to save the environment doesn't work for people. It's not how people are wired, okay? Even in a purely socialist environment, where you have an elite, the educated elite, that tell people what they're allowed to think, do, have, want, it doesn't work that way. Bigger, better, faster, more is how humans, how our brains, how our psychology works. So that's the answer to environmentalism. Bigger, better, faster, more. Give me an electric truck that does the job better than this truck, and I will gladly get rid of the fucking maintenance issues of having a gasoline-operated truck, or diesel, whatever, internal combustion truck. No problem! What, you think I'm against that? But it has to do the job. And, for me, there's a couple of factors in there. And those are factors that I could modify to a certain extent if I had a reason, okay, an incentive. And this gets to the core argument of my core argument about one of Pete's statements, okay? Buttigieg stated that it should not be necessary for Americans to own a car to prosper. And that is a very interesting statement. It's a very global statement. First, it's not necessary for a resident of New York City to own a car to prosper. Not at all. Okay? This is a thing, all right? Who's that anarchist kid? The one who sounds really great until you dig into the ideas. Michael Malice, okay? he was talking on a podcast recently with Michaela Peterson, where he's talking about going to Austin, about getting out of the city, and all these things that are scary, like, oh my God, like having to learn how to drive. I'm like, that's New York City. Lots of people in New York City don't even know how to drive. There's also a generational thing I've noticed here. I'm in a rural town. It's a county seat in Nevada. We haven't moved all the way yet, but we're going down south. But there's a surprising number of people in the younger age groups who haven't learned how to drive. There's a fear, an agoraphobia, a culture shift. But these aren't people who bicycle, who jog, who it's an agoraphobia. It's not a car thing. It's a getting off the couch and going outside where the scary world is thing. And I do need to address that in some videos, especially in light of how broadening travel is and how much of a cultural facet that is. But we'll get to that later on. So, Buttigieg says that he's stating very, very baldly that he feels that the current situation makes it necessary to own a car to prosper. Well, his definitions are all fucked up, okay? Because you can't compare New York City to, you can prosper in Reno without a car, but to say Kingman in Arizona, all right. Lake Havasu City in Arizona. It's a very spread out city. You can't make this comparison, okay? And then there's prosper. What does prosper mean? Okay? Is he talking about a paycheck? Is he talking about an ability to have the right job for the right pay? Because, some jobs do have requirements for travel. Some jobs just are in this location or that location. And due to regulation by governments, you can't build your house close to where the workplace is or what have you. It's it's a very funny statement because it's manifestly untrue. Okay, New York City, you do not need a car to prosper. In fact, a car is a very expensive luxury item that you have to consider whether or not you want to have at all in New York. It's absolutely an expense. Okay, so how does he apply this logic? And he gets these responses, and you get these responses from people who don't want to go through the hassle of owning a car, but they want the transportation. And so the feeling here is that what Pete is offering is magical transportation for free. And that's not what happens. It's not how it works. It's not anything in his plans. Okay? He is advocating, he does want a massive infrastructure increase for mass transit. How does that work? How does that work out here? How does that work in rural America? How does that work in the Big West? I'm not even sure how you can work that one in Los Angeles, okay? What does he mean? Well, apparently he means lots and lots of light rail. But light rail only goes where it goes. It's not very flexible, okay? It's a really good trunk system. Like if we had rail that could take POVs on it, it would actually be a huge benefit. Okay, it's kind of like the Boring Company wants to make throughways for your POVs, which is smarter than putting them on rail cars, but you could put them on rail cars and go whoop, light rail, have an express route. That works perfectly well. Ferries do it a lot in some areas where it makes sense. You can also reduce the size of POVs. There's an incentive program for that. I'll talk about that again later. It's part of my previous video series. make it easier and more pleasant for people to have smaller vehicles, and it makes it much easier to do intermodal transport. That's a word, intermodal, and it has a specific meaning which you need to actually understand for this conversation to make any sense. So, it should not be necessary to own a car to prosper. And it's a bullshit statement. It's a nothing statement. It doesn't mean anything. There are people who feel restricted because they can't drive. Okay? There are people who feel restricted because they don't want to spend money on a car. They want to spend money on a PS5 instead. Okay, these are factors, but there's nothing that says that you must own a car to prosper. It does, however, increase your freedom to choose different jobs, different locations, different living areas. That's key. The reason is because it's freedom of travel. It's a freedom of movement on a larger scale than is generally possible on foot, although you might be surprised at how much you can get around on foot and what the time involved actually is. Freedom of travel. That's the key element. So when you look at what he's doing is he's somehow indicating that there should, that dangerous word, should be some system other than personal owned vehicles that will increase your ability to have personal freedom of movement. It doesn't make any sense, okay? It doesn't make any sense at all. I'm not a fan of internal combustion engines. I'm not a fan of this much rubber pollution in my lungs. There's a lot of things I'm not a fan of, but we need to talk about what your replacement options are. Where's the bigger, better, faster, more in this? Is Pete Buttigieg actually going to provide people in my part of the country, people like me with some increased ability to travel freely under my own control by eliminating my car? No, he can't. He's not going to put light rail on a dirt road that has 4 houses on it. Not happening. Okay? Does the BART. I've used BART in the Bay Area. I've used the DC Metro system. I love the Metro system. Does that increase your freedom of movement? And the answer is no. It doesn't. So as much as I liked the DC Metro, and I've been car-free at various times in my life, on purpose, intentionally, it's never increased my ability to travel ever. Like, just never. It never works out that way. The DC Metro makes it very convenient to not have to find a parking spot and such if you can work within the bounds of the system. And that is the thing, is you have to work within the bounds of their hours, their buses, their train stations. If you work within their system, it's not bad. The best thing about the DC Metro is that you can drive to it and then go into DC without a car. As long as you're not staying out too late, your needs aren't too weird, you can plan around the transit times, then it's cool. It's really fun. It's an advantage because you don't have to drive around in city traffic. But you still have to get there, all right? You have to either live within that half mile, 1 mile of the transit system, or you have to get there, transport yourself there. That's a big deal. And there are weather situations in Virginia where it's actually not that fun to walk a mile with a baby to the transit station either. Done that, right? So think about this. Think it through a little bit. This is Pete Buttigieg's big statement. And look at it sideways. Look at it from the point of view of, is it necessary to own a vehicle to prosper? And the answer is no, it's not. However, it increases your choices. What Pete Buttigieg is trying to say is that there should be some other system, some government system that provides you with the same access, the same convenience in your right to travel as having a personal vehicle. There's no way to do that. Okay? There is no way to do that. Not saying that it's a bad idea to build light rail in cities. I love urban rail systems. I think it's fantastic. I think it's a great idea. In fact, I'm perfectly fine with the idea that most dense urban areas should have restrictions on vehicles beyond a certain point, because it makes more sense. Like, it doesn't make sense to try to drive in downtown Santa Monica. The big parking structure, and then your metro line. Totally fine with that. Okay, it's a city-by-city choice, and it has to do with the structure of your city, the demographics, how it's built, your physical landscape. But I'm okay with that idea. But there's no magic that's going to extend that out past your dense urban core. And look at what he says. Even what he says there is that if you live in that dense urban core, you should be able to have that high-paying job in an oil field, at a mine, rawhide mine, 50 miles that way, on a ranch, without having to ever worry about a car. You can't. It makes no sense, And people will argue, well, that's just a small percentage. The majority of Americans are urbanized, but it's just a small percentage of people who literally cannot handle having a car for whatever psychological reason, okay? There's very, very, very little in American society, very, very small groups of people who literally cannot afford a car. And those that cannot afford a car, the reason most often is regulation, okay? We are regulated to death in terms of vehicle ownership, firearms ownership too. But we are regulated to death. It is at least 5 times as expensive to get a vehicle as it needs to be for what the vehicle does because of regulation. Some of the regulations are good, some of them really aren't, okay? The mandated OBD2, there's a lot of mandates that have nothing to do with your safety, and there's a lot of those safety mandates that wouldn't apply if you had different classes of vehicles, okay? Speed limits, weight classes, driver's license types. And then there's the endless rounds of smog, the safety inspections. You go to many states, and it's several $100s a year just in inspection fees. This isn't even your registration, okay? This is inspection fees. These are costs and regulatory hurdles to prosperity. They're much bigger in terms of being costs and hurdles than just buying a car. So Pete, as an arm of the government, might need to look at how much the government has in terms of a negative impact on the bottom parts of our population being able to afford to drive. Because that's a big deal. Stay sideways. We'll talk some more in a little bit.